Daniel Morgan did not scream. The British drummer kept beating the cadence while the lash cut through his back again, and again, and again. Around them stood rows of soldiers from the most disciplined army in the world, watching a punishment designed to erase a man completely. 500 lashes, that was the sentence. In the 18th century, very few men survived anything close to it. The point was not simply pain, it was annihilation. The British Army believed discipline was stronger than courage, stronger than patriotism, stronger than hatred. Break one man publicly, and 100 others would obey without question. Morgan remained standing. By the time the punishment ended in 1755, blood had soaked through what remained of his shirt, yet he was still conscious. Years later, he would joke that the drummer must have miscounted. According to Morgan, the British had only managed 499 lashes. They still owed him one. 25 years later, that same man would command American troops at Cowpens and destroy one of Britain's finest field forces in less than an hour. That was not revenge. It was the collapse of an entire military system, because the British Army believed it understood exactly how soldiers reacted under pressure. Daniel Morgan spent decades learning that system from the inside, and then used its own assumptions to tear it apart. To understand how one nearly executed wagon driver built one of the greatest tactical victories of the American Revolution, we have to begin long before Cowpens, before Saratoga, before Washington trusted him with independent command. Back when Daniel Morgan was simply another rough frontiersman living on the violent edge of Britain's North American empire. Morgan was born around 1736 in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. Even the exact year remains uncertain because nobody expected his name to matter. He left home as a teenager after a bitter dispute with his father and drifted south through Pennsylvania before settling in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley near Winchester. Winchester was not the polished colonial America often shown in paintings. It was frontier country. Dense forests surrounded isolated farms. Wagon roads disappeared into the Appalachian Mountains. Beyond them stretched contested territory claimed by Britain, France, and dozens of native nations. Every shipment, every settlement, every mile of road carried risk. Morgan fit naturally into that world. He was enormous for his generation, standing around 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and tremendous physical strength. He had little formal education and never became an accomplished writer, but nobody questioned his intelligence. Instead of classrooms, he learned through experience, hauling freight across dangerous mountain roads, negotiating with settlers, surviving harsh weather, and solving problems where mistakes could be fatal. His profession became wagoning. To modern ears, it sounds ordinary, but during the French and Indian War, a wagoner was part transporter, part mechanic, part guide, and often part soldier. Supply wagons carried everything an army needed to survive: flour, powder, shot, spare muskets, medicine, tents, and artillery equipment. Lose the wagons, and entire campaigns could collapse. Morgan became exceptionally good at it. He knew the backcountry roads better than many British officers. He understood rivers, mountain passes, weather patterns, and how quickly an army could outrun its own supplies. Those lessons would later prove just as valuable as anything learned on a battlefield. In 1755, Britain launched one of the largest military operations ever attempted in North America. Major General Edward Braddock arrived with nearly 2,100 British regulars and provincial troops to capture the French stronghold at Fort Duquesne, located where Pittsburgh stands today. London expected a straightforward campaign. Professional soldiers, disciplined formations, superior firepower, and experienced officers would sweep aside scattered French forces and secure the Ohio Valley. Instead, Braddock's expedition exposed a weakness hidden inside Britain's military machine. European armies moved like carefully engineered mechanisms. Long supply columns followed narrow roads cut through forests. Every regiment marched according to rigid doctrine. Everything depended on order. North America's wilderness cared nothing for European doctrine. Morgan joined Braddock's expedition as a civilian wagoner, moving desperately needed supplies toward the advancing army. Day after day, he watched British officers struggle to force European methods onto terrain that constantly fought back. Roads disappeared into mud. Wagons broke apart, horses died from exhaustion, progress slowed to a crawl. Then came the incident that changed Morgan's life forever. During the campaign, Morgan became involved in an altercation with a British officer. Contemporary accounts differ on the precise details, but they agree on the outcome. Morgan struck the officer, knocking him down. In the British Army, striking a superior officer ranked among the gravest offenses imaginable. The sentence was immediate: 500 lashes. The punishment was intended to restore discipline. Instead, it created one of Britain's most dangerous enemies. The British Army never expected Daniel Morgan to become a soldier. After the whipping, he returned to the only life he knew, hauling freight through the Virginia frontier. To British officers, he was just another colonial teamster, strong enough to drive wagons, useful enough to move supplies, but hardly someone who belonged among professional soldiers. That assumption would become one of the Empire's greatest blind spots. Because Morgan had spent years watching the British Army from a position few officers ever occupied. He was neither a gentleman nor a commissioned officer. He moved with the supply trains, listened to conversations around campfires, watched columns form before dawn, and saw how experienced officers solved logistical problems hundreds of miles from civilization. While others admired Britain's discipline, Morgan quietly learned how that discipline actually worked. The lesson was simple. The British Army was extraordinarily effective, as long as everything happened according to plan. Every regiment depended on precise formations. Every maneuver relied on officers being able to communicate clearly. Muskets fired devastating volleys because hundreds of men acted almost like one machine. Their discipline was not just impressive, it was the foundation of the entire army. But machines have limits. Dense forests broke formations apart. Hills blocked visibility. Thick smoke swallowed commands. Long supply lines slowed movement. Officers often knew less about the terrain than the local farmers fighting them. Morgan never forgot any of it. Those observations became even more valuable on July 9, 1755. General Braddock's expedition approached the Monongahela River, expecting only scattered resistance before reaching Fort Duquesne. Instead, a force of French soldiers, Canadian militia, and native warriors launched a sudden attack from dense woodland. The battle turned into chaos almost immediately. British officers tried to deploy according to European doctrine, dressing their lines and ordering controlled volleys against an enemy they often could not even see. Smoke filled the trees. Horses panicked. Officers became obvious targets in their bright uniforms. Commands that sounded perfectly clear on an open European battlefield disappeared inside the forest. The regulars continued trying to fight the battle they had trained for. The battlefield refused to cooperate. Within hours, nearly two-thirds of Braddock's force had been killed or wounded. General Braddock himself suffered a mortal wound. Of the 86 officers who entered the battle, 63 became casualties, an astonishing loss that crippled command and control. The defeat shocked the entire British Empire. Europe's most respected army had not been beaten by larger numbers or superior weapons. It had been defeated by terrain, flexibility, and an enemy unwilling to fight according to European expectations. Morgan survived. More importantly, he understood why the disaster had happened. Many British officers dismissed Braddock's defeat as an unfortunate exception. Morgan reached the opposite conclusion. He began to believe that the wilderness itself was changing the rules of war. Armies that insisted on fighting exactly as they had in Europe would continue paying an enormous price. At the time, however, Morgan had neither rank nor influence. He returned once again to civilian life in Virginia, building his wagon business and slowly acquiring land near Winchester. He married Abigail Curry in 1773, started a family, and appeared to settle into the life of a successful frontiersman. Then, in April 1775, everything changed. News spread rapidly through the colonies that fighting had erupted at Lexington and Concord. What many colonists had expected to be another political crisis had become open war. Virginia moved quickly to organize companies of riflemen. These were not conventional soldiers. Most came from the frontier, where survival depended on marksmanship rather than parade ground drill. Their Pennsylvania and Virginia long rifles could hit targets at distances British muskets rarely matched. The drawback was obvious. Rifles loaded more slowly, lacked bayonets, and were poorly suited for fighting in dense linear formations. Many British officers dismissed riflemen as little more than troublesome hunters. Morgan knew better. In 1775, he was elected captain of one of Virginia's rifle companies, made up largely of experienced frontiersmen from around Winchester. These men owned their own weapons, understood rough country instinctively, and could march astonishing distances without complaint. The company quickly earned a remarkable reputation. When Congress ordered rifle companies to reinforce the siege around Boston, Morgan's men covered roughly 600 miles in just 21 days, an extraordinary feat for 18th century infantry. They crossed mountains, rivers, and primitive roads at a pace that surprised even other American units waiting for them in New England. Their arrival carried an important message. The Revolution was no longer just a New England rebellion. The frontier had entered the war, and with it came men who fought very differently from either European regulars or traditional colonial militia. George Washington noticed them almost immediately. He saw something many British commanders still failed to recognize, that Morgan's riflemen were not replacements for regular infantry. They were an entirely different military tool. Used correctly, they could shape a battlefield long before the main armies ever collided. That realization would eventually help produce one of the most innovative tactical victories of the entire Revolution. But first, Daniel Morgan would march north into Canada and walk straight into the worst campaign of his military career. Morgan's riflemen had reached Boston in record time, but they would not stay there for long. The Continental Congress had approved an ambitious plan that, on paper, looked almost unstoppable. American forces would invade Canada, seize Quebec, convince French-speaking Canadians to join the Revolution, and eliminate Britain's northern base before the Crown could launch major offensives down the Hudson Valley. It was a bold strategy. It was also one of the most difficult military operations attempted during the entire war. Two separate American armies would advance into Canada from different directions. General Richard Montgomery would move north through Lake Champlain after capturing Fort St. John's in Montreal. Colonel Benedict Arnold would lead a second column through nearly unexplored wilderness in what is now Maine before joining Montgomery outside Quebec City. Arnold needed experienced riflemen. Washington immediately thought of Daniel Morgan. Morgan and roughly 100 of his Virginians joined Arnold's expedition in September 1775. What followed was less a military march than a prolonged fight against nature itself. The route covered almost 350 miles through forests that barely existed on military maps. Soldiers dragged heavy bateaux upstream against powerful currents, carried equipment across endless portages, and hacked roads through dense woodland where no roads existed. Food spoiled in constant rain, rivers flooded without warning. Cold nights arrived weeks earlier than expected. The expedition had been supplied for a difficult journey. It turned into a survival exercise. Navigation errors pushed the column farther into the wilderness than planners had anticipated. Several boats leaked so badly that flour dissolved into useless paste before it could be eaten. Salt pork rotted, powder became damp despite every effort to protect it. Within weeks, starvation replaced the British Army as the expedition's greatest enemy. Men boiled leather equipment to soften it enough to chew. They stripped bark from trees. Some accounts describe soldiers eating candles made from animal fat simply because there was nothing else left. Entire companies began falling behind. Others turned back altogether. Arnold refused. So did Morgan. Years spent on the Virginia frontier had hardened Morgan's riflemen differently from many soldiers around them. They knew how to hunt when game appeared, how to move through broken country, and perhaps most importantly, how to keep functioning after weeks of exhaustion. While the expedition steadily shrank, Morgan's company remained among its most dependable elements. Finally, after nearly 2 months, the survivors reached the heights overlooking Quebec. What they saw was deeply discouraging. The city stood behind massive stone walls that had protected it for generations. Winter was closing in. British defenders had reinforced the garrison. The Americans possessed too few heavy guns to conduct a proper siege. Waiting only strengthened the defenders. Attacking looked almost impossible. Montgomery and Arnold decided they had only one realistic option. They would strike during a snowstorm on the final night of 1775, hoping darkness, wind, and blowing snow would conceal their approach before the defenders understood what was happening. It was exactly the kind of operation where discipline could collapse in minutes. The attack began before dawn on December 31st. Two diversionary attacks targeted the upper walls, while Arnold and Montgomery led separate assault columns against the city's weaker lower defenses. Almost immediately, the plan started unraveling. Montgomery's column advanced through blinding snow toward a narrow barricade near Pré de Ville. Before his men could properly deploy, British defenders unleashed a devastating cannon blast loaded with grape shot. Montgomery was killed instantly along with several senior officers. His entire assault collapsed within moments. On the opposite side of the city, Arnold pushed forward until a musket ball shattered his leg. Command passed to Daniel Morgan. Everything that happened next demonstrated why Washington would later trust him with independent commands. Instead of retreating after losing both senior commanders, Morgan drove his riflemen deeper into Quebec's narrow streets. His men captured the first barricade in brutal close combat and pressed forward before the defenders could recover. But Quebec itself became the British Army's greatest ally. The twisting streets prevented coordination between American detachments. High stone buildings created deadly choke points. Fresh British troops sealed exits behind Morgan while firing from windows, rooftops, and successive barricades. Every intersection became another fortified position. Morgan kept attacking. Again and again, his riflemen forced their way forward, believing reinforcements would eventually arrive. They never did. Separated from the rest of the American force, surrounded inside unfamiliar streets and running dangerously low on ammunition, Morgan's command found itself trapped inside the city. Hours after the assault had begun, he faced a decision no commander wanted to make. Continue fighting until every man was killed, or surrender. Morgan chose surrender. Nearly 400 Americans became prisoners, including one of Washington's most promising battlefield leaders. For many officers, Quebec would have ended their military careers. For Daniel Morgan, it became another classroom. He had now witnessed two catastrophic campaigns, Braddock's defeat and Quebec's failed assault. Both had something in common. Neither army had failed because its soldiers lacked courage. Both failed because good soldiers were forced into plans that no longer matched reality. Morgan never forgot that distinction. When he was finally exchanged in 1777 and returned to the Continental Army, he came back with something far more valuable than battlefield glory. He had learned exactly how quickly brilliant plans could collapse. And years later, at a South Carolina pasture called Cowpens, that lesson would become the foundation of the battle that shattered Britain's southern campaign. When Daniel Morgan finally returned to the Continental Army in 1777 after his prisoner exchange, he found a very different war. The British had abandoned Boston, but they had not lost the Revolution. In fact, they were preparing something far more dangerous. London approved a massive campaign designed to split the colonies in half. General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada with nearly 8,000 British, German, Loyalist, and native troops, seize the Hudson River corridor, and link up with British forces advancing north from New York City. If the plan succeeded, New England, the political heart of the rebellion, would be isolated from the rest of the colonies. On paper, it was an excellent strategy. Burgoyne commanded professional soldiers, powerful artillery, and some of the finest officers in the British Army. Most European observers expected the campaign to end the rebellion within a year. Washington understood the danger. But he also understood something else. Daniel Morgan was no longer simply a frontier rifle captain. He had become a commander who understood how British officers thought under pressure. Washington detached Morgan and roughly 500 picked riflemen from the main army and ordered them north to reinforce Major General Horatio Gates. It was an unusual decision. Washington rarely gave away his best light troops, especially when he still faced General William Howe around Philadelphia. Yet he believed Morgan's men could influence an entire campaign far beyond their numbers. He was right. As Burgoyne advanced south through northern New York, his army encountered problems that looked small individually, but became devastating together. Roads had to be carved through dense forests. Bridges were rebuilt almost daily. Supply wagons stretched for miles. Every additional cannon slowed the column. Every mile farther from Canada made resupply more difficult. American militia constantly attacked foraging parties, destroyed bridges behind them, and cut communication lines. Burgoyne continued advancing, convinced that disciplined regulars would eventually force the rebels into another conventional battle. Morgan intended to prevent exactly that. Instead of throwing his riflemen into the main battle line, he used them as precision weapons. Their job was not to exchange volleys with British infantry. Their job was to dismantle the British command system. Unlike smoothbore muskets, the American long rifle could accurately engage individual targets at ranges well beyond normal musket combat. Loading remained slower, making rifles unsuitable for close-order fighting, but in broken terrain, they offered something the British rarely expected: selective fire. Morgan instructed his riflemen to focus on officers, artillery crews, engineers, mounted messengers, and anyone directing the movement of British units. It was a subtle but revolutionary way of thinking. European battles normally targeted formations. Morgan targeted decisions. Every officer forced to take cover delayed an order. Every messenger who failed to arrive created confusion. Every artillery crew disrupted reduced British firepower without requiring Americans to capture the guns themselves. The psychological effect proved just as important as the physical one. British officers were accustomed to leading from the front, where visibility allowed them to maintain control over disciplined formations. Suddenly, every exposed officer became a potential target hundreds of yards away. Command itself became dangerous. That pressure reached its first major test during the fighting around Freeman's Farm on September 19, 1777. Morgan's riflemen advanced ahead of the American line and collided with British advance elements moving through heavy woodland. Instead of standing in place and exchanging volleys, the riflemen fought exactly as Morgan intended. They fired, moved, disappeared behind trees, shifted position, then fired again from somewhere entirely different. British light infantry repeatedly attempted to pin them down, only to discover that the targets had already vanished into another patch of forest. The woods denied the British their greatest advantage. Perfect formations became impossible. Long lines fragmented into isolated companies. Orders took longer to travel. Visibility collapsed. Morgan had seen this happen 22 years earlier during Braddock's disaster. Now he was causing it deliberately. One incident quickly became legendary. British General Simon Fraser rode across the battlefield rallying wavering units with remarkable composure. Wherever Fraser appeared, British resistance stiffened. His presence alone restored order. Morgan recognized the pattern immediately. He reportedly identified Fraser as the true center of British control and directed one of his finest marksmen, Timothy Murphy, to engage him from long range. Murphy climbed into a tree, steadied his Pennsylvania rifle, and after several carefully aimed shots, struck Fraser. Whether every detail of the later accounts is perfectly accurate remains debated by historians, but Fraser was mortally wounded, and his removal had an immediate effect on British coordination. Once again, Morgan had attacked not simply soldiers, but the mechanism that held the army together. Burgoyne's offensive continued, but its momentum was fading. What had begun as a confident march toward Albany was slowly turning into a campaign of exhaustion, shrinking supplies, mounting casualties, and growing uncertainty. The British still possessed disciplined infantry. They still possessed artillery. They still believed they could win the decisive battle. What they had not yet realized was that Daniel Morgan had already begun teaching the Continental Army a completely different way to fight. Not by overpowering Britain's strengths, but by making those strengths increasingly difficult to use. The campaign reached its climax on October 7, 1777. By then, General Burgoyne had been trapped near Saratoga for weeks. His situation grew worse every day. American militia kept arriving, swelling Gates's army to well over 12,000 men, while British strength had fallen below 7,000 effectives. Food was running short, horses were dying, ammunition wagons could not be replaced. Every mile back toward Canada became more dangerous than the one before. Yet Burgoyne still believed he might recover the initiative. Rather than wait for the Americans to attack on ground of their own choosing, he assembled a reconnaissance force of roughly 1,500 carefully selected troops. The column included British regulars, German infantry, grenadiers, artillery, and some of his best officers. Officially, they were probing the American left flank. In reality, Burgoyne needed answers. Was Gates preparing to retreat? Could the British break through before their supplies disappeared? Or were they already surrounded by an army larger than they imagined? Morgan immediately understood what Burgoyne was attempting. This was not a full-scale assault. It was an opportunity. If the British reconnaissance force could be isolated from the rest of Burgoyne's army, its destruction would expose the entire British line. Morgan wasted no time. He pushed his riflemen forward into the woods once again, screening the American advance while Brigadier General Enoch Poor's brigade moved against the British right. Instead of launching one massive frontal attack, the Americans struck from multiple directions, forcing Burgoyne's officers to react before they fully understood where the main threat was developing. Once again, Morgan attacked the British command system before attacking the army itself. His riflemen spread through the trees, picking off officers, artillery crews, and mounted messengers whenever opportunities appeared. British batteries struggled to maintain accurate fire because crews repeatedly lost the men directing them. Orders arrived late or not at all. Then the battle accelerated. As American pressure increased, British units attempted to redeploy into stronger defensive positions. On an open European battlefield, disciplined maneuver usually restored control. In the forests around Bemis Heights, it did the opposite. Trees broke visibility. Smoke hid formations. Different regiments lost contact with one another. Every attempt to reorganize created new gaps somewhere else. Morgan saw those gaps forming almost immediately. Instead of slowing down to preserve a tidy battle line, he exploited every opening before the British could close it. This was precisely the opposite of how most 18th century commanders fought. Conventional doctrine emphasized maintaining formation above almost everything else. Morgan prioritized momentum. Whenever one British position began to weaken, fresh American troops poured into the breach before officers farther down the line even realized what had happened. The pressure became relentless. General Simon Fraser, despite already being wounded earlier in the campaign, was no longer there to restore collapsing sectors with his personal leadership. Burgoyne's remaining commanders fought skillfully, but every decision arrived one step behind events. Then came the turning point. American troops captured key forward positions protecting the British right flank, exposing the defenses around Bryman's Redoubt, a fortified position manned largely by Brunswick troops under Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Bryman. If the redoubt held, Burgoyne might still stabilize the battlefield. If it fell, his entire defensive system would begin to unravel. Morgan recognized its importance immediately. Rather than launching a slow, methodical siege, American forces attacked from several directions almost simultaneously. Riflemen kept defenders pinned, while Continental infantry closed the distance. Fighting quickly dissolved into brutal close-quarters combat with muskets, bayonets, and clubbed weapons inside and around the earthworks. The defenders resisted fiercely. Bryman himself attempted to rally his men under intense fire, but he was mortally wounded during the struggle. Without coordinated leadership, organized resistance inside the position collapsed. The redoubt fell. Its loss transformed the entire campaign. Burgoyne suddenly faced a battlefield that no longer possessed a coherent defensive line. American troops now threatened his rear, his artillery positions, and the roads leading north. Remaining British units withdrew in increasingly difficult conditions toward Saratoga, abandoning ground they could no longer defend. For the first time since leaving Canada, Burgoyne's army was no longer conducting an offensive campaign. It was fighting simply to survive. Morgan had not destroyed the British army through overwhelming numbers. He had helped dismantle the very mechanism that made Britain's professional soldiers so dangerous. By constantly attacking officers, disrupting communication, exploiting terrain, and refusing to fight on British terms, he transformed discipline from a strength into a liability. But Saratoga, remarkable as it was, would not become Daniel Morgan's greatest masterpiece. 3 years later, deep in the South Carolina backcountry, he would finally command an army entirely his own. And there, at a cattle grazing ground called Cowpens, every lesson learned since those 499 lashes would come together in a battle that military academies still study nearly 2.5 centuries later. By the winter of 1780, the war had entered a new phase. The British had shifted their main effort to the south, convinced that thousands of loyalists would rally once regular troops restored royal authority. Charleston had fallen. An entire American army under Benjamin Lincoln had surrendered. Horatio Gates then marched another force straight into disaster at Camden, where Cornwallis shattered it in one of the worst defeats of the Revolution. On paper, British victory looked inevitable. General Charles Cornwallis commanded experienced regulars supported by disciplined loyalists. Among his most feared officers was Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, only 26 years old but already famous for relentless speed and aggressive cavalry tactics. Tarleton had built his reputation on one principle: attack before the enemy has time to think. His mixed force of cavalry, infantry, and light guns routinely marched extraordinary distances, catching American detachments before they could organize. At Waxhaws, his command had become associated, fairly or unfairly, with accusations that surrendering Americans were cut down after the fighting had effectively ended. Whether every later account was accurate remained disputed, but one fact was undeniable. Across the southern colonies, Tarleton's name inspired fear. Washington needed someone who understood how to defeat exactly that kind of commander. He chose Daniel Morgan. Morgan received only around 1,000 Continentals and militia, hardly enough to challenge Cornwallis directly. His mission was deceptively simple: operate independently in the South Carolina backcountry, encourage Patriot militia, threaten British communications, and force Cornwallis to divide his army. Cornwallis responded exactly as Morgan hoped. Believing Morgan's detachment vulnerable, he ordered Tarleton to hunt him down before the Americans could gather strength. The trap had begun. Morgan immediately understood something that many commanders overlooked. Tarleton's greatest strength, his speed, had become his greatest weakness. Every previous success had reinforced the young British officer's confidence. Again and again, rapid attacks had broken inexperienced militia before they could stand and fight. That history shaped his expectations more than any written orders. Morgan intended to exploit those expectations. Instead of retreating toward the mountains where escape routes were limited, he selected an open grazing area known as Cowpens. At first glance, the choice seemed questionable. There was a broad field suitable for cavalry, nearby woods, a shallow stream behind the American position. To some officers, the stream appeared dangerous because it limited avenues of retreat. Morgan saw something entirely different. He had no intention of retreating. On the evening before the battle, Morgan gathered his officers and explained his plan. It did not rely on superior numbers. It did not rely on better weapons. It relied on predicting exactly how Tarleton would react. Morgan knew his army contained three very different types of soldiers. At the front stood several hundred militia, many brave men but with limited experience, fighting disciplined regular infantry in prolonged combat. Behind them waited another militia line composed of more seasoned troops under Andrew Pickens. Finally, on a slight rise, stood the Continental Regulars commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard, professional soldiers capable of standing toe-to-toe with British infantry. Most commanders would have placed their strongest troops first. Morgan reversed the order. Then, he gave the front militia an instruction that shocked many officers. Do not try to win the battle. Fire 2 carefully aimed volleys. Then withdraw. Not run. Withdraw. There was an enormous difference. Morgan was not sacrificing the militia. He was using them to shape British expectations. He understood Tarleton's mindset almost perfectly. If the militia fired briefly and then fell back, as many militia had done in previous battles, Tarleton would almost certainly conclude that the American line was collapsing. He would press harder. His infantry would accelerate. His cavalry would prepare to exploit what appeared to be another rout. And in doing so, the carefully controlled British advance would gradually lose its cohesion. Exactly as Morgan wanted. Everything depended on discipline, not British discipline, but American discipline. The militia had to resist the temptation to flee completely. Howard's Continentals had to hold their fire until the precise moment. William Washington's cavalry had to remain hidden until the battlefield opened. One mistake, one misunderstood order, one unit panicking too early. The entire plan would collapse. Morgan spent the evening riding quietly between campfires, speaking directly to individual companies instead of delivering grand speeches. He reminded the militia that he was asking for only 2 volleys. Not an impossible stand, not a suicidal sacrifice, just enough time for the next part of the plan to work. Many of these men had fought under him before. They trusted him. Before dawn on January 17, 1781, Tarleton's advance guard appeared. As expected, the British commander had driven his men through exhausting forced marches to catch Morgan before daylight. His soldiers were tired. Many had eaten little. Horses had covered miles of difficult roads with almost no rest. Tarleton believed exhaustion did not matter. Speed always had. Across the field, Daniel Morgan watched the British deployment through the morning mist. Everything was unfolding almost exactly as he had predicted. Now came the only question that mattered. Would Tarleton remain patient, or would he do what he had always done? Attack immediately. The British attack began exactly as Daniel Morgan had predicted. Shortly after sunrise on January 17, 1781, Tarleton ordered his advance forward without waiting for the rest of his force to deploy fully. Speed had carried him to victory too many times before. Every previous campaign had taught him that American militia broke under pressure. Once they started running, pursuit finished the job. This time, the battlefield had been built around that expectation. Morgan's skirmishers opened the fight, firing from scattered positions before falling back behind the main line. Tarleton barely slowed. His infantry continued advancing while his cavalry searched for an opening to ride down retreating Americans. Then the first militia line fired. The volley ripped into the approaching British regulars at close range. Morgan had personally instructed these men to aim carefully, not at the center of the formation, but at officers and sergeants leading the advance. Before the smoke cleared, they fired a second volley. Then they withdrew exactly as ordered. From Tarleton's perspective, everything looked familiar. The American front line was retreating. The battle was already being won. He urged his men forward. That single decision decided the battle. As British infantry surged ahead, their formation gradually stretched apart. Units that had begun the morning in neat alignment became separated by fences, uneven ground, and the growing pace of the advance. Officers struggled to maintain intervals while trying to keep pressure on what appeared to be a collapsing enemy. Then Pickens's second militia line delivered its fire. Again, disciplined volleys struck the advancing British. Again, the Americans began pulling back. Tarleton saw confirmation of exactly what he expected. The militia were breaking. He committed even harder. His soldiers pressed forward at increasing speed, believing they were only moments away from complete victory. But every yard they gained carried them deeper into Morgan's trap. Behind the withdrawing militia stood Howard's Continental Regulars. Unlike the militia, these men had no orders to retreat. They waited in silence, muskets loaded, bayonets fixed, holding their fire until the British closed the distance. Then something happened that nearly destroyed Morgan's entire plan. As Howard attempted to adjust part of his line against pressure on the right, one company misunderstood the order and began pulling back. Nearby companies assumed a general withdrawal had been ordered. Within seconds, much of the Continental line started moving to the rear. For one terrifying moment, it looked exactly like a real retreat. Even Morgan believed the line might collapse. Tarleton certainly did. Seeing the Continentals falling back, he abandoned caution altogether. His infantry charged. The cavalry accelerated. British officers shouted for one final push. They believed the battle was over. Howard suddenly realized the mistake. He rode among his men, turning them back toward the enemy. Officers restored order with astonishing speed. The line halted, dressed its ranks, and faced about. The British were now less than 30 yards away. Howard gave the order. A single devastating volley erupted almost point blank into the advancing British line. The effect was immediate. Men in the front ranks fell by the dozens. The momentum of the charge stopped almost instantly. Before the British could recover, Howard's Continentals fixed bayonets and advanced. At that exact moment, the militia who had withdrawn earlier turned around and rejoined the fight on both flanks. Then came the final blow. Colonel William Washington's Continental Cavalry held back throughout the battle, swept around the British right and slammed into Tarleton's mounted troops. Almost simultaneously, mounted Patriot militia attacked from another direction. Within minutes, British units found themselves surrounded. Front, flanks, rear. The hunters had become the hunted. Organized resistance collapsed. Some companies fought stubbornly until overwhelmed. Others attempted to surrender. Tarleton himself escaped with a small group of cavalry after a brief clash with William Washington, leaving much of his command behind. The battle had lasted less than an hour. The results stunned both sides. Of roughly 1,100 British troops engaged, more than 800 were killed, wounded, or captured. Morgan's force suffered comparatively light losses, fewer than 80 casualties in total. But numbers alone do not explain why Cowpens became one of history's classic battles. Morgan had accomplished something far more important than defeating a single British detachment. He had turned Britain's greatest military strengths into predictable weaknesses. British discipline encouraged aggressive pursuit once an enemy appeared to break. Professional confidence encouraged officers to press advantages quickly. Years of success against militia convinced experienced commanders that retreat almost always meant collapse. Morgan used every one of those assumptions against them. He never asked inexperienced militia to behave like British regulars. He asked them to perform one realistic task and built the entire battle around what they could actually do. It was not a victory built on heroics alone. It was a victory built on understanding people. Cornwallis immediately marched after Morgan, desperate to recover from the disaster. Instead, the pursuit exhausted his army, stretched his supply lines even further, and helped set in motion the campaign that ended 9 months later at Yorktown. In many ways, Cowpens marked the moment when Britain's southern strategy became irreversible. 26 years earlier, the British Army had tied Daniel Morgan to a whipping post, believing that pain could enforce obedience. Instead, they helped forge one of the most innovative battlefield commanders of the American Revolution. They believed discipline alone won wars. Morgan proved that understanding your enemy's discipline could win them instead. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the campaigns that shaped the American Revolution, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. What was the true turning point at Cowpens, the discipline of Morgan's men, or Tarleton's decision to attack exactly as Morgan expected? Also, let us know where you're watching from. Your answers always help shape future episodes.